Okay, welcome everyone to the Climate Justice and Commonwealth series hosted by the Ramphal Institute. My name is Kelsie Garbutt, and I am the Climate Justice Program Lead as a part of the Ramphal Institute, and I will be moderating and hosting these sessions. So thank you for being here. We have an insightful amount of sessions coming up this month, so please check it out later on Eventbrite after this one is finished. So our first webinar will examine the role of colonialism, particularly the British Empire, and how it has created climate injustices within the former colonies, which now make up the Commonwealth. So let's first begin. Let's just go to the agenda first. So we will take you through an introduction to what climate justice is. Then we have 4 segments with our panelists where we discuss colonialism in their respective countries, ongoing climate injustices that they're facing today, the importance of historical responsibility, and especially how that historical responsibility comes to play when talking about things like repatriations. And then we'll end with some closing statements. So we don't really have any Q&A timed in for today, but if we do have time, we can take maybe a few questions. If you have particular questions for our panelists, you can, I will post a link soon where you can post that question and I will pass it on to them. So for our introduction, we hear a lot about climate justice, and here are just a couple headlines that have been in the news. Can I ask everyone to please mute themselves as well? Thank you very much. So yeah, there's a couple headlines all the time that are in the news. A couple here, flooding disproportionately harming Black neighborhoods. So climate justice in particular, climate change will inevitably impact everyone. However, with existing unequal political and socioeconomic systems, there will be people, communities, and countries that are more vulnerable to these effects and their ability to adapt to extreme weather changes. Climate justice acknowledges that climate change is more than just an environmental issue, but also a social and political one. Therefore, climate solutions require an intersectional approach that will safeguard the most vulnerable and address these existing social and political inequities. So climate injustice happens at different levels. Today, we'll examine it at the country level. Those in the global south who are developing countries or countries in coastal areas or small island developing states that are mostly high risk geographically usually are the countries that contribute the least to global emissions, but are most impacted by climate adversities and ill-equipped to adapt accordingly. So now we're just going to do an interactive session just to make sure I haven't lost anyone as yet. Sorry, let me just make sure that this is going on. One second, let me just fix my Slido because it's not working. Sorry, everyone. Just one quick second, let me fix this. Okay, so we'll skip this part for now. We'll come back to it if we have some time later. Okay, so in terms of colonialism and how it comes into play with any of this. So in 2022, the IPCC finally acknowledged in their 6th assessment report that colonialism is a historical and ongoing pattern of inequity that influences climate vulnerability. In the context of the Commonwealth, British colonial rule disrupted sustainable systems by exploiting and depleting key natural resources, displacing native citizens and recognizing the culture between the people and their land, and all to further British international trade. In doing all this, Britain also became one of the biggest greenhouse gas emitters. According to research studies, the UK's domestic emissions account for 3% of total world emissions dating back to 1850. But when considering the emissions in countries once under the British Empire, this percentage rises to more than 5%. So you can see here on the graph that UK is now the 4th global emitter. So these injustices have disadvantaged the Commonwealth nations, many of whom must now reckon with sea level, desertification, and loss of biodiversity. It is important to address the historical emissions of big emitting countries like the UK in order to pave a path forward for vulnerable countries to become more climate resilient. Repatriation is an important element for rectifying past injustices and to equip these countries with the resources to prepare and adapt for the effects of climate change. Okay. So today we have 3 panelists from Commonwealth nations who will examine these past and ongoing effects in the context of their countries. So our first panelist is Mr. Philemon Tuavanualevu. Mr. T is the acting director for the Climate Change Division under the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of the Government of Fiji. In his capacity, they are involved in developing climate change policies and mobilizing climate finance to the needs of the relevant stakeholders. Our second panelist is Ms. Emily Uju-Masawa. Ms. Uju-Masawa is the associate of the African Research Universities Alliance and has worked in the field of climate policy development and implementation since the establishment of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on a Framework Convention on Climate Change. She was a technical lead on climate negotiations on behalf of the government of Kenya for over a decade and has served as coordinator of UNEP's accreditation to the Adaptation Fund as a multilateral implementing entity. She later supported developing countries in getting accreditation for direct access to climate finance under the Adaptation Fund. And finally, our third panelist is Mr. Carlon Mendoza. Mr. Mendoza is a climate policy advisor for Climate Analytics Caribbean. He's an attorney at law and legal consultant called to the bar in both Trinidad and Tobago and Belize. He served as the legal counsel for the Belize Tourism Board and has held the post of magistrate with the Judiciary of Belize. His work is currently focused on climate change law and policy, disaster law, and disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean. So welcome to all of our panelists. I'm going to stop sharing now. And can I just have all of our panelists turn on their cameras? Okay, so we'll dive right into the first segment. And I will start it off with Mr. Mendoza. And we want to discuss, do you believe that colonialism has led to climate injustice in your country?
Thanks for having me to the Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are. So just to simply say yes, the simple answer is yes, that the legacies of colonialism, particularly in the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago by extension, has dealt with the issue of colonialism and the debt and the continued inequality that was created. And because of these inequalities, we have an exacerbation of the vulnerabilities to climate change within our region. And I'm glad that you had that sort of introduction as to what climate justice really is. And importantly, the IPCC noted that the vulnerability of people, communities, and the ecosystems to climate change differs substantially among and within regions, and are driven by patterns of intersecting socioeconomic development, unsustainable ocean and land use, inequity, marginalization, historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism and governance. And particularly for the Caribbean, being most island territories, small island developing states being governed by at least the British Empire, because there were a number of empires that came and colonized several territories, and there was certain battles over these territories. It is clearly evident today through our structural inequalities, our issues with relation to development and systemic issues. We see that climate justice and the impact of climate change is really being felt within our islands. And even further to that, the colonialism itself shaped most of our legal systems and minimized the influence of our indigenous practices on our legislations and policies. So quite frankly, today we still have a number of laws on the books that are pre-independence, post-independence, dating back to 1962, which have not developed or emerged with the times. And unfortunately, most governments are being more reactive than proactive because disasters, climate change, these issues are dynamic and ever evolving. So those are things that we still grapple with within the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago in particular. We can go even right to the recent events of the pandemic where some public health emergency regulations were called into play. And these emergency regulations did not develop in time to really deal with the situation, so that there were ad hoc regulations being passed and being instituted just to combat with these problems. So in essence, yes, we have seen the impact of colonialism within our country, and it's something that needs to be considered deeply and understood more generally by the public and policymakers when dealing with combating issues of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Mendoza. We'll definitely circle back to some of those. And then I will ask Ms. Ujumasawa to answer the same thing. You're on mute.
Sorry. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here to contribute to these discussions. By the way, I am not very conversant with the issues of colonization, but I did a little history in school on this, so I know I can contribute to this, of course, using also my background in climate change. So do I believe? Of course, colonialism has led to climate injustice in my country. And it's not only in my country. When I talk here, most of the points actually will cover most of the African countries. I used to be chair of the African Group of Negotiators. So I'm quite conversant with some of the issues covering the other countries too. And for us, countries that are really reliant on our ecosystems and reliant on nature, it's very important that we look at what colonialism did, because that is actually how the discussion under this topic can really deal with what we feel needs to be on the table. Because it's through the extraction of natural resources from our countries that the Western countries have gotten to be where they are now. These resources have and continue to enable the European countries, and of course, the United Kingdom is included here, in getting rich. When you look, on the one hand, you look at the countries which were colonized, you see that we are the highest when it comes to the vulnerability scale. and most vulnerable to climate destabilization. And this does tell you something about what happened, because some people might say it happened too long time ago. It's not long time ago. Colonization is still present. And why was it that these countries decided to colonize our countries? First of all, I guess it was mainly because they were running out of resources and issues of poverty, and the major one being industrialization. So, and that is one of the things actually that we are also looking at. These are countries where we belong to, we are trying to industrialize. We helped these countries industrialize. At the same time, we were also a very cheap source of labor. And we can go into the slave trade discussions, but I don't believe this is a very healthy topic. Then, of course, there are the mineral resources which were extracted. And all these, including the farming practices where new ways were introduced, land was, for example, the wetlands were drained through the use of alien species, for example, like the eucalyptus, and landscapes changed and developed into ways that made our countries now extremely vulnerable with these increased hazards. I think this issue needs further discussions. I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
No, I think that's very important what you said too. A lot of people think that colonialism was very long ago, but the effects of it are still ongoing, and that's why it's important to acknowledge it and make sure that we dissect it and pave a way forward. Especially what you said again, they changed the dynamics of how people really interacted with their land, because none of it was really for the gain of the colonies and the territories that they ruled over, but it was for their own gain. Okay, so it seems that we will only have 2 of you today. So we'll go on to the next segment. And I'll again begin with you, Mr. Mendoza. How do these injustices exacerbate the climate vulnerabilities that your country faces today? And I think you mentioned a bit about this already.
Yes. So particularly when we're referring to these climate vulnerabilities and the impact that these injustices had on our country, I'm speaking from a very holistic point of view, because we in the Caribbean, not particularly Trinidad and Tobago, even though we experience issues of flooding and very heavy flooding and heavy rainfall, where the location of our island, in particular, the most southernmost Caribbean island, the hurricane belt affects our sister isle of Tobago mainly, or majority, but all the other islands are susceptible to these increasing and devastating hurricanes. And when we speak about vulnerability, we speak about the many interlinked issues experienced within these countries and these islands. We speak about issues concerning poverty, inequality, access to basic services, education, governance capacities, and all these other I would say problems or issues that were a clear result or direct result of the histories of colonialism. And these points are further supported by the IPCC in their report, their second report, AR6. So I spoke about the hurricanes and the impacts of Hurricane Irma and Maria on the Caribbean. And that particularly impacted Dominica as well as the Bahamas, two islands within the Caribbean chain. And because of these history of discrimination and colonization, we see that, you know, over 224% of Dominica's GDP was affected. And this came about as a result of being consecutively ravaged by hurricanes in 2015 and then in 2017. And we look to see that because of the vulnerabilities that exist, in order to build back better, and you know, that is the phrase that we use in the sustainable development and the disaster risk reduction space. In order to build back better, we sometimes run the risk of just rebuilding. And it's not about building back better, but just recuperating the loss and damage that has been experienced. And it's because of the fact that we are not in a position to afford to build back better. And you speak about injustices, you speak about vulnerabilities, and now we can link that aspect of finance and being placed in further debt because of the fact that you now have to rebuild. So those are just some of the issues and the links between the injustices that we have experienced as colonial territories and the climate impacts that we are feeling today. So that's just, I'll leave it here and we could come back and discuss further.
Thank you, Mr. Mendoza. And can I pass it on now to Ms. Ujumasala?
Thank you very much. And I'm entirely in agreement with Mr. Mendoza on the issues that he raises. And even following up on what I had given in my initial remarks, you know, that the injustices have exacerbated the vulnerability of Kenya and even Africa as a whole is one thing which, even as the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention was being negotiated, was recognized by parties. Because if you look at that document, Africa is the only continent mentioned. 4.1E, Article 4.1E talks of Africa. And this is in relation to issues of desertification and drought, some phenomena that really became widespread due to colonization and mismanagement of land. So, as I said, that Africa is vulnerable is recognized by the convention, and also in several of the previous IPCC reports, Africa has been recognized as being vulnerable. You also mentioned that this issue has also been captured by the IPCC in their latest report. So it's not only Africa, but the whole issue of colonization is now recognized globally. But I go on and ask how has the issue of climate justice then shaped our international discussions since it was recognized so early? And this actually was done because, again, you see, when you look at the treaty, the convention includes, for example, the polluter pays principle. So those emissions that we are talking about and that you mentioned, Kelsie, they are very well covered here. Those emissions that happened those ages ago, quite a bit are still up in the atmosphere and contributing to the problem that we are having. Then there's the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities. This was captured so as to ensure that countries like mine are supported to be able to deal with the adverse impacts of climate change. So really the fundamentals have been captured, but as I guess it's clear in the ongoing negotiations, we are yet to really make available the resources that would support our countries, not only deal with the impacts of climate variability, but also climate change. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a very interesting topic, especially in the context. So there's a bit two parts to it. There is the actual physical damage that was done to these territories. That's one aspect, and that are still felt today. And like you said, Mr. Mendoza, it's a lot of trying to like recuperate from that, and the resources are still very slim to do that. And then the other aspect of it is that, you know, they contributed globally a lot to the global emissions, which again, these countries that are most vulnerable have to reckon with. And we didn't contribute, we contributed the least to it, but we're still, you know, having to deal with those effects. So again, the conversation is very important to have. And that leads me to next question about acknowledging the historical responsibility. What do you think is the importance of this? Because a lot of people do say, why are we talking about this? Or we can't really hold anybody accountable anymore because it happened so long ago, there's a new generation. How do you measure this properly to ensure that, you know, we can rectify it in a way that's equitable for everybody?
Thanks for that question, Kelsie. And again, going off of what Ms. Emily had just said, it is important because in the line of work that Climate Analytics Caribbean is engaged in, we do a lot of work in the Caribbean on loss and damage and understanding exactly how we can, one, determine and distinguish between the economic and non-economic loss and damages that we have suffered or are going or potentially can suffer through the impacts of climate change, as well as understanding that what Ms. Emily pointed out with respect to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, that the fight to recognize this historical responsibility of countries has been embedded into that process and into the letter of the treaty and the agreement established and agreed by consensus amongst parties, that the global north should pay their fair share to address the climate crisis that has been caused by their historical emissions. The two agreements recognize that developed countries should lead in combating climate change and addressing the related impacts in accordance with the CBDRC common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So historical responsibilities must be acknowledged, and it is being acknowledged within the UNFCCC process. Whether it is bearing fruit is another question, and whether it's working to our advantage. But the fact of the matter is that it is mentioned and it is referred to there. And importantly, the respective capabilities aspect, I would say, attempts to recognize it doesn't do much to solve the issues that we would have experienced because of colonization, but it does a bit to understand that there is a demarcation between developed and developing countries and the capabilities that developing countries would have to implement adaptation measures, mitigation measures, finance transitions to low greenhouse gas economies, because we're speaking about most of the developing countries that are engaged in industrialization and activities that promote greenhouse gases, even though it's to a lesser extent. The only reason it came about is because of colonization in most instances. So it is something that is being recognized. I would also even go further to say that it must be acknowledged, because if we ignore it and we ignore colonialism and the impact of colonialism, when it comes to, say, if we are to just receive Eurocentric measures that are being handed down to us in terms of how we deal with adaptation and how we deal with mitigation issues, those things can cause more harm than good. We need to understand positions and levels and especially capabilities. We don't want to be in a position where there is a heavier burden being placed on developing countries, particularly small island developing states and other countries in the global south, to shoulder the impact of climate change and the climate crisis on communities. So I will stop there and give way to the other speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Mendoza. Ms. Emily.
And thank you. I couldn't agree more. You see, this issue must be acknowledged. And the reason why I feel it must be acknowledged is, especially when you look at now how issues on when we talk about the finance gap and the adaptation gap and all this, it's made to look like we created these problems. Most of this, as I indicated, we can also trace to colonialism. And that is why colonialism must be acknowledged. The countries themselves must also accept that they have benefited from our resources, and that is why they are where they are. And it's only proper that now that we are talking about resources to enable us to build our adaptive capacity, that it should not be such a difficult conversation. For the other thing I wish to say here is that, and I'll say because I have been in this process right from the beginning, is now we have reached a stage where based on the nationally determined contributions that countries are submitting, it's very clear that all the countries are almost being treated as equal. You know, those divisions that we had in the convention, where we had Annex 1 parties and non-Annex 1, this was so as to ensure that certain activities were taken by or rather we were given a lead in the work by the bigger emitters, and the countries from Africa, for example, that barely emit emissions as of this year. It keeps changing because it even falls within the margin of error. We are not even sure whether we are emitting, that they are supported. But now we are all lumped together. So at a certain point, all these issues, if not really brought to the fore, we are going to reach a point where even the vulnerable are actually going to be forced to do just as much as the developing countries that are responsible for the climate change that we are experiencing. So this has to be acknowledged. It may not be that I don't even think measurements can be made. It will not be easy. It will even take too much time. Even apologies just to start. And then since the developed countries have more resources, meet their obligations. The 100 billion that we've been talking about, these are just signs that that there's goodwill on their side, and we are all here to sort out the problem. Thank you.
Thank you both. Yeah, the recognition is very important. And even when it came out in the IPCC report, it was almost a bit shocking because it hadn't really been acknowledged before then. And everybody had been fighting, especially all of the indigenous activists, they've been fighting to say like, hey, colonialism is a factor in this fight. In your line of work, for both of you, have these topics ever come up during, like, with your colleagues or even anywhere in the industry?
Yes, definitely. The topic of colonialism and the impacts have come up. I can give a clear example of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance that was initiated by CANARI, which is the Caribbean Natural Resource Institute. And within that alliance, there are several working groups that seek to address a number of issues and the impact of climate change and in furtherance of a climate justice agenda for the Caribbean. And there's particularly a subgroup on human rights, and there's and the just transition. And both subgroups interface with the issue of colonialism, the issue of discrimination, of injustice. And it is something that the civil society of the region is completely head and shoulders with in understanding that, because the question spoke about historical recognition in the context of reparations as well. And I know we'll get to reparations in the next section, but just to briefly touch that, in order for us to really get out of some of the situations that we were placed in, there must be a need for finance, and not in the forms of debt, in terms of loans, and the access to finance is also something that must be considered, where grassroots communities can access finance, indigenous peoples can access finance to reinvigorate their practices and methodologies that was erased or forgotten. So I would leave it as that there. So yes, short answer.
And I'll also say yes, it comes up, and particularly our civil society is very strong on this, but so is the African group of negotiators. When we talk of including Africa's special circumstances as an agenda item in the negotiations, these are some of the issues that we want to be put on the table. So I'll also just leave it here. I don't want to go into our special circumstances. We would talk a lot on this, but yes, it's very key.
All right, now we'll move into repatriations, which seems like a lot of people talk about. It could be a bit controversial sometimes. And there seems to be a lot of climate funds available. You know, COP does. At the last COP, they raised money for loss and damage. But so we know that they exist, these streamlined processes exist, but are they working? Are these countries accessing these funds? And so what kind of repatriations has your country received from the past or presently? And what are the, when you get it, do you have, what are the requirements then when this money is given? And we can start with you, Mr. Mendoza.
Sure. So I can't really say what exactly the country or government of Trinidad and Tobago has received, but what I can speak about is the availability of certain funding from the Green Climate Fund, other donors, philanthropic donors, foundations that are based in the global north or Europe, that there is an existence. Let's leave it at that. There's an existence of funding. And I think let's dial back. As you rightly said, a lot of persons either focused on reparations, they're focused on we have to make them pay and we have to get money and that sort of thing. And there's another school of thought where reparations can come in different forms, and not necessarily solely financing. But for the purpose of this discussion, I would stick to the finance aspect of it. And as you rightly said, at COP last year in Dubai, there was the establishment of a new loss and damage fund, which can be seen as maybe one of the biggest indicators of a fund similar to reparations. And given the fact that it opened up the COP with a number of pledges from number of European countries or developed countries, even some developing countries as well pledged into the fund. But let's remember that those are pledges, and the fund is still under a transitional period where it still has to be fully developed in terms of constitution, in terms of the institutional arrangements, etc., etc. It needs to be fully fleshed out. But what we can say is that with the establishment of this fund and any other climate finance mechanisms, particularly for SIDS and Caribbean countries, we should be very wary or ensure that these funds do not create additional debt burdens for the already indebted climate vulnerable countries that are least responsible for loss and damage. It should primarily prioritize grants and non-debt finance, not loans at all, to climate vulnerable countries. It could incorporate use of blended finance instruments that are responsive and appropriate to the specific needs and circumstances. So we hear that term being used by the AGN, but it's also a term that is used by SIDS, the paying attention to the needs of small island developing states within these discussions. So with respect to that, there is that aspect of funding available. But then we can speak about whether or not when this funding is available, access to the funds, there's not particularly a number of red tape or bureaucratic issues or problems associated with accessing funds. We know a number of funds are available, but it entails sometimes these institutions or regional institutions, civil society organizations, grassroots communities, though they might look on paper that they have access because of capacity constraints, just general understanding, and something as simple as filling out documents on the internet can be a barrier to access. And it is important that we recognize that there are barriers that would exist and what we do to combat these barriers in accessing these funds. So I'd leave it at that. I don't know if the other speaker has more tangible examples of reparations, but before I conclude, the Bridgetown Initiative, that is a initiative taken by the Barbados government, led through the Prime Minister of Barbados, speaks specifically to reparations as a form of climate justice. And I think that's very important, that it has to be taken up by governments. It has to be led by governments making those calls 24/7. And it has to be led, civil society alone can't do it. And again, this is maybe another result or issue of colonialism in terms of how we operate, in terms of the strata or the levels within our society. But politics and governance plays a very critical part in access at times. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Good points there. All right, Ms. Ujimasawa.
Here I can only offer my apologies as I did not get this information. As I told you earlier, I haven't worked on these issues as such, and I'd contacted one of my colleagues from Foreign Affairs, and she's yet to send me the information. But should they come, I'll send them to you directly. So as a result, I'm not even aware whether Kenya has received any kind of help or even resources and which can be captured under reparations. But certainly, when we look at the loss and damage fund, it could be a mechanism that could begin working towards that. But let's remember that even as we are looking at the loss and damage fund, again, the sort of funding that will be availed and to what activities, we will really have to see how we capture some of the issues and in fact ecosystem damage that have arisen out of climate change. How could they be supported under that fund? And of course, as all the other funds that we have set up, the issue of direct access is very key. Thank you.
Thank you both as well. Yeah, like you said, there are definitely a lot of barriers. Mr. Mendoza, you mentioned even like the paperwork of the barriers. Do you want to expand a little bit more on that?
I could expand on maybe a very limited scale within the current work that I do now on climate justice and climate policy within the Caribbean, and to say that some institutions or some organizations receive large funding from certain donors to do work, and those funding comes in the forms of sometimes of re-grants. And it would be in a smaller number, and several grants would be available. Several grants would be made available to civil society organizations, and you'll put out a call for civil society organizations within the region to apply for grants for work being done in the environment, on climate justice related issues, on climate change projects, rainwater harvesting projects, etc. And whilst there are a number of organizations and community organizations, particularly in Dominica, in St. Lucia, even in Trinidad and Tobago, who work in these areas, one, because of the fact that they may not want to be aware of it, so awareness is key. Two, they may not have the capacity because they feel that sometimes in this re-granting process, there's like about a 20-page document to complete before. And whilst for bigger organizations that have the capacity to hand that to someone to deal with, these smaller grassroots organizations are maybe mainly family-led or on a volunteerism basis. And the persons might not have the time or the capacity to engage with the entire process of applying for these small grants. So that's just a small example of it. We could look at larger scale examples, but I don't have the evidence or the information about that at the moment. But that is what I was referring to with respect to that sort of capacity and access.
Thank you. And like you said, it really does need to come. It's like a top-down process. It needs to come from the government for sure. In terms of, because we are a part of Commonwealth nations, do you both have any experience with, you know, the Commonwealth Climate Access Fund that the Commonwealth offers, or anything to say about what the Commonwealth should be doing in terms of repatriations? And we could start with Ms. Uju Masawa.
Thank you, Kelsie. I think there is quite a bit that we can have the Commonwealth support. And that comes to my mind because I saw a question, someone asking for me to talk a little bit about what Arua does. Because we were created in response to the continent's climate-related development challenges. So some of the challenges, and the very immediate ones, include issues such as even just reporting and the various agreements under the UNFCCC, reporting under national communications, the biennial reports. Yes, so our countries have been having issues with that, and now we have the enhanced transparency mechanism for countries to understand and how the reporting is somewhat changed. So we've been trying to help on that under Arua, and we have received funding from UK aid. So those are areas where, for example, the Commonwealth could help dealing with issues of gender and how we engage them in the reporting, because in a number of instances where we reviewed the nationally determined contributions, and we looked at the stakeholder engagement, it became very apparent that most of the, a number of groups had not been engaged. So such things, including even just providing support to strengthen the various country positions on putting issues key to members of the Commonwealth on the table. Thank you.
I think if I have the question clear, in terms of what more can the Commonwealth do?
You've gone on mute again.
Sorry, yes. What more can the Commonwealth do with respect to climate justice, reparations, etc.? I think that for the Caribbean in particular, CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, for those on the call, that is the organization that most of the Caribbean member states are aligned to with respect to high-level policy and just regulations. They have developed a 10-point plan on reparations, and that whole dealing with reparations in particular. It does not specifically mention climate justice or climate crisis, but I think it's an opportunity. It presents an opportunity for like-minded organizations such as the Commonwealth to, I would say, join forces or support that plan and that 10-point plan, and also include elements of climate and the climate crisis within that 10-point plan, because it is something that has been acknowledged in terms of colonialism, the impacts of it. It has been acknowledged, but now we need further steps than acknowledgement. And support is always a way, a first way in terms of where you have unified voices championing for one result. So I would say that the Commonwealth as an organization that is led by the British government or the British should really and truly hone in and focus on other aspects, whether it be from the African nations or the Caribbean nations or nations that were colonized, and really and truly pay attention and support some of the plans and steps that need to be taken with respect to addressing climate justice, reparations, etc.
That's very interesting that you say that. A lot of the times too, what I hear from many climate professionals, especially from the Commonwealth, is they feel that they're now taking it upon themselves to create these funds and these projects, because waiting for the Commonwealth or developed countries to help is taking a very long time. The Commonwealth itself does, like reparations could be financed, and it can also be many climate projects to help civil society. And we'll learn about that in our next webinar when we have the Commonwealth Secretariat. It'll talk about their Climate Finance Access Hub and how that has helped. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, because where it is recognized, but at the same time, there needs to be more action towards actually accessing these funds and making sure that they're also sustainable, because when these funds are finished, what happens after? And that's an important conversation as well. Okay, so we do have some extra time, and I will open up to anybody who has any questions. Please just drop it in the chat.
Just to clarify, I saw Nicholas post that it's not led, and I maybe had a tongue slip, but I mean the head of the Commonwealth is the king, but I don't know in terms of organization, in terms of the Commonwealth Foundation or organization, etc. Those different leads. But apologies, I don't mean to ruffle any feathers with respect to leadership.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, if you guys want to just have some closing statements, and then we can wrap it up there.
No more necessarily content-wise closing statements, but to say that thanks for the opportunity to just have this discussion. I think it's a good initiative from the Ramphal Institute in bringing light to climate justice in particular, and understanding exactly that climate justice has a number of different horizons, and colonialism could possibly be seen as the starting point of these discussions. So I think it's a very timely discussion leading up in terms of what we just came out from the last COP with the energy package through the last global stocktake with respect to the phasing out of fossil fuels and the impact of that on developing countries as well. And now the urgent need for finance to engage in such activities. So I think it's a timely discussion, and I look forward to the continued series.
Thank you, Mr. Mendoza. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so my appreciation too. I'm very thankful that I was allowed this opportunity to be here. Now, one of the things, and again, I always go back to my heart of being part of the African group of negotiators, is I would wish to also have, because I find this sort of discussions very helpful, because they also help people and various groups understand where certain countries and certain groups of countries are coming up when they espouse certain issues. And I was wondering if the Commonwealth could be doing this sort of getting the various groups that fall under the Commonwealth, I guess the AGN, the CARICOM, so that we get to appreciate where we are all coming from. Like I was saying earlier, when we talk about the special circumstances for Africa and why we are so stuck on it, and possibly for the AOSIS to understand why we believe we are vulnerable. I think it would help us also help the process under the UNFCCC, and not to see, and not for other countries to see that we are asking for something unreasonable. Because you will notice that ever since up to Bali, we always had Africa, LDCs and AOSIS. It was always following each other like that. Now suddenly Africa's dropped off, and one must ask, so what happened to Africa overnight? There has to be, we really need to get together. But of course, that is just one issue. There are several that we could sit and iron out and have easier time in the negotiations, for example, and even bringing in new issues such as climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ujumasawa, and thank you, Mr. Mendoza. I see a question in chat, but Mr. Mendoza has to drop off now, so I will pass on that question to him. But yes, thank you so much for being here and for adding to an insightful conversation. Again, it is a very preliminary discussion, and there is so much that you can go in depth with on this topic. Next week, we will explore what the Commonwealth is doing in terms of climate action, reparations, finance-wise, and also climate project-wise. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you, Kelsie. That went really well. And thanks to everyone else for joining our session today. And
thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ramphal's institutions. Thank you, everyone.